The war had raged for 3,000 years, and nobody remembered who threw the first shot. Admiral Kess of the Valdari Empire stood before the massive holographic display showing the neutral zona, graveyard of twisted metal and burned worlds that stretched across 7 star systems. Her 4 arms moved in practiced efficiency, adjusting tactical displays while her secondary brain calculated casualty reports. The numbers were staggering. Entire species reduced to scattered refugees, planets rendered uninhabitable and still. The Thakari Confederation pushed forward with their relentless advance. Another supply convoy destroyed at Meridian Station, reported Captain Vale, his crystalline carapace clicking nervously. The Thakari used their new plasma bombardment technique. Nothing survived. Kess closed her primary eyes, exhaustion weighing on her like gravity itself. The Valdari had been the galaxy's peacekeepers for millennia, but this war was different. The Thakari fought with a brutality that defied comprehension, their bioweapons turning captured worlds into toxic wastelands. What had started as a border dispute over mining rights had escalated into a galactic catastrophe. "Initiate Protocol Omega," she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of desperate authority. "Send envoys to every civilized species in the galaxy. If we don't form a coalition now, there won't be a galaxy left to save." The response came swiftly. Within days, representatives from 47 species gathered aboard the massive diplomatic vessel. Harmony's voice. The assembly hall buzzed with translation matrices working overtime as beings of every conceivable form debated their survival. There were the gaseous airings floating in containment fields, the rock-like granite lords whose words resonated through the deck plating, and the swift Zephyrians whose thoughts moved faster than their words. But one species was notably absent. "What about the humans?" asked Ambassador Rin of the Aquatic Federation, her gills fluttering with concern. "Earth's location puts them directly in the Thakari expansion path." An uncomfortable silence fell over the assembly. Humans were the galaxy's newest spacefaring species, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago. They'd been politely ignored by most civilizations, too primitive to matter, too young to contribute anything meaningful to galactic affairs. "They weren't invited," Admiral Kess admitted. "Their technology is centuries behind ours. What could they possibly offer against Thakari bioweapons and plasma artillery?" The debate continued for hours, species after species pledging their fleets to the cause. The Technological Union offered their advanced shielding systems. The Hive Collective promised their instantaneous communication networks. The ancient observers shared tactical data spanning millennia of warfare, but as reports filtered in from the front lines, hope dwindled. The Thakari had broken through 3 defensive perimeters in a single day. Their new weapon, something they called the Life Eater, consumed organic matter at the molecular level, leaving nothing but sterile dust in its wake. It was then that the impossible happened. Captain Vale burst into the assembly hall, his usual composure shattered. "Admiral," he gasped, "you need to see this. The Thakari fleet, it's retreating, all of it. Every ship, pulling back to their home systems." The hall erupted in confused chatter. Retreat wasn't in the Thakari vocabulary. They fought until death, driven by a biological imperative that made surrender impossible. "There's more," Vale continued, his voice trembling. "We're receiving a transmission from Earth, they say. They say they'd like to discuss terms. Every great bond starts with a single moment of courage. HFY Chronicle Stories is just beginning, and your support matters. If you love emotional sci-fi tales, forbidden connections, and stories that stay with you, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us bring more stories from the stars to you." Admiral Kess stared at the communication officer with all 4 eyes. Earth, the primitive world that hadn't even been invited to the coalition? Impossible. "Put them through," she commanded, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. The holographic Display shimmered, and suddenly they were looking at a human female, middle-aged by their standards, sitting calmly behind what appeared to be a simple metal desk. She wore no ceremonial robes, carried no symbols of rank, and looked utterly unremarkable by galactic standards. "Hello," the human said, her tone conversational. "My name is Dr. Emma Cross, and I represent the United Earth government. I believe we need to talk." The silence in the assembly hall stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 47 species, each representing civilizations that had mastered the stars for millennia, stared at the unremarkable human woman on their screens. Dr. Emma Cross seemed entirely unbothered by the attention, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos her very presence had caused. Admiral Kess found her voice first. "Dr. Cross, with respect, Earth wasn't included in this coalition because you assumed we had nothing to contribute." Emma interrupted gently. "I understand. 2 centuries of space travel versus your thousands of years of galactic civilization. The math doesn't look favorable for us." Ambassador Rin's gills fluttered with barely contained emotion. "The Thakari have retreated. Our sensors confirm it. After 3,000 years of relentless advance, they're pulling back to their core systems." "What did you do?" Emma's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a depth that seemed to extend far beyond her apparent age. "We talked to them." A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. The crystalline chorus of Vex began their harmonic translation protocols, convinced they'd misunderstood. The granite-skinned monoliths rumbled with what might have been laughter. "Impossible," declared High Counselor Drac of the warrior caste, his battle-scarred hide glistening under the chamber lights. "The Thakari don't negotiate. They can't negotiate. Their biology prevents it. They're driven by conquest imperatives, coded into their very DNA." "That's what everyone believes," Emma agreed. "We believed it too, initially. But humans have a saying, everyone's fighting their own war. We wondered what the Thakari were really fighting for." Captain Vale's carapace clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. "They're fighting to consume and expand. It's what they do, what they've always done." Emma shook her head slowly. "No, Captain. They're fighting to survive." The words hit the assembly like a physical blow. For 3,000 years, every intelligence agency, every military strategist, every xenobiologist had studied the Thakari. They were the perfect predator species, engineered for warfare, incapable of peace, driven by an insatiable hunger for conquest. "Explain," Admiral Kess commanded, her 4 arms moving to defensive positions despite the impossibility of physical threat through a hologram. 3 weeks ago, we sent a small diplomatic vessel to the edge of Thakari space," Emma began. "Not to fight, not to threaten, but to observe. What we found wasn't an empire of conquerors. It was a species in the final stages of extinction." The assembly erupted in disbelief. The ancient observers, whose collective memory spanned geological ages, began rapid consultations with their archives. The Technological Union's quantum processors worked at maximum capacity, trying to reconcile this information with known data. "The Thakari homeworld is dying," Emma continued over the chaos. "Has been for millennia. Their sun is destabilizing not naturally, but because of an accident that occurred long before most of your civilizations achieved sentience. An experimental energy extraction project went wrong, fundamentally altering their star's fusion process." High Counselor Drac's voice boomed across the chamber. "Even if true, this changes nothing. They've destroyed countless worlds, eliminated entire species." "Because they had no choice," Emma replied, her voice carrying a weight of sadness that seemed to resonate with something deeper than words. "Their biology was artificially modified to create perfect soldiers for a war that ended before most of them were born. But the modifications came with a price. They can only survive in environments with specific radiation signatures. Environments like their dying homeworld, or like the worlds they've been terraforming through conquest." Ambassador Rin's aquatic form pulsed with bioluminescent patterns of confusion. If this were true, why didn't they simply ask for help? The galactic community could have what? Emma's interruption was gentle but pointed. Welcomed the species that had been portrayed as mindless monsters for 3,000 years, offered assistance to beings whose very appearance triggers fear responses in most sentient creatures. The Thakari tried diplomatic contact exactly once, over 2 millennia ago. The response was the formation of the first anti-Thakari coalition. The historical records were being accessed by dozens of species simultaneously. Slowly, reluctantly, the truth began to emerge. The first Thakari diplomatic mission had indeed been met with immediate military response, based on assumptions about their intentions that had never been questioned. So they did what any desperate species would do, Emma continued. They fought for survival in the only way they knew how. Each conquered world bought them a few more generations of life. Admiral Kess felt something she hadn't experienced in centuries' uncertainty about a conflict she dedicated her entire career to fighting. Even accepting your analysis, Dr. Cross, this doesn't explain how Earth convinced them to retreat. Emma's smile was sad but genuine. We offered them something no one else had in 3,000 years, hope. The silence that followed Emma's words wasn't empty, it was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of 3 millennia worth of assumptions crumbling in real time. The assembled representatives found themselves staring at a species they'd dismissed as primitive, realizing that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their military might. It was their willingness to see enemies as people. Dr. Cross, Admiral Kess said carefully, what exactly did you offer them? Emma's image shifted slightly as she leaned forward, her human eyes meeting the Admiral's alien gaze across impossible distances. A new home. But more than that, a chance to be something other than what they were forced to become. The Technological Union's senior representative, a being of pure energy contained within a quantum matrix, pulsed with skeptical patterns. Impossible. The Thakari require specific environmental conditions. The radiation signatures alone can be replicated, Emma interrupted. Earth's governments have been working on terraforming technologies for decades. Not for conquest, but for expansion of our own growing population. When we analyzed the Thakari's actual needs rather than their apparent aggression, we realized we could help. High Counselor Drax's scarred hide darkened with suspicion. And in return, what does Earth gain from harboring the galaxy's greatest threat? Emma's response carried the weight of absolute sincerity. Peace, real peace, not just the absence of war. Captain Vale's carapace clicked in patterns of disbelief. The Thakari have bioweapons that can sterilize entire continents. Why would you trust them? Because, Emma said quietly, we understood something the rest of the galaxy missed. Those weapons weren't created for conquest, they were created for terraforming. The Thakari were never trying to destroy life on the worlds they conquered. They were trying to make those worlds suitable for their own biology. The revelation hit the assembly like a shockwave. Weapons of mass destruction recontextualized as desperate survival tools. The ancient observers began frantically cross-referencing historical data, their collective consciousness processing implications that spanned millennia. 3 weeks ago, we made contact with the Thakari High Command, Emma continued. We presented them with detailed terraforming proposals for 17 uninhabited worlds in the Outer Rim. Worlds that could be modified to support their biology, without displacing existing life. Ambassador Rin's bioluminescent patterns flickered with cautious hope. And they agreed? They wept, Emma said simply. A species that the galaxy has feared for 3,000 years broke down and wept when we offered them hope instead of bullets. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried something different, the sound of minds changing, of fundamental assumptions being challenged by the simple power of human empathy. Admiral, Kes found herself thinking of her own species' first contact with the Thakari 2 millennia ago. The fear, the immediate military response, the assumptions that had seemed so obviously correct at the time. Had they created their own enemy through fear and misunderstanding? "Dr. Cross," she said slowly, "what you're proposing, it's not just about relocating the Thakari. It's about fundamentally changing how the galaxy approaches conflict." Emma nodded. "Every war has two sides, Admiral. But every war also has two sides who stop listening to each other. Earth's proposal isn't just about ending this conflict. It's about making sure we never create another one like it. The Granite Lords, whose species communicated through geological timescales, rumbled their ancient wisdom. The young species sees what the old species forgot." High Counselor Drac stood slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the chamber. "Even if everything you say is true, the Thakari have committed acts that cannot be forgiven. Entire species have been eliminated." Emma's expression grew heavy with sorrow. "Yes, they have. And those losses can never be undone. But the question isn't whether we can forgive the past, it's whether we can prevent future tragedies by choosing understanding over fear." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of human history, a species that had fought countless wars before learning to forge peace from the ashes of conflict. The Thakari delegation is prepared to make full reparations for their actions. They're offering their terraforming technology to restore worlds damaged in the conflict. They're willing to submit to galactic oversight during their relocation. Most importantly, they're asking for the chance to be judged not by what desperation forced them to become, but by who they choose to be moving forward. The ancient observers pulsed with patterns of deep contemplation. The humans speak of choice. This is unusual. Most species are defined by their nature. Humans suggest that nature can be transcended. Emma smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd shown during the entire exchange. "That's what makes us human, I suppose. We believe that anyone can choose to be better than they were." The vote, when it came, wasn't close. 47 species had entered the assembly convinced they were planning a final desperate stand against an implacable enemy. By the time Dr. Emma Cross finished presenting humanity's proposal, 39 of those species were ready to attempt something unprecedented in galactic history, turning enemies into neighbors. But 8 species remained unconvinced, and their opposition carried significant weight. The warrior caste, scarred by millennia of conflict with the Thakari, couldn't accept that their ancient enemies might simply want to survive. The pristine collective, whose worlds prized biological purity above all else, feared contamination from Thakari terraforming technology. The Trade Federation worried about economic disruption from suddenly peaceful borders. Admiral Kes watched the debate unfold with growing concern. A divided response would doom any chance of lasting peace. With respect to our human friends, High Counselor Drac addressed the assembly, his words carrying the authority of a species that had fought and bled for 3,000 years. Earth has been at peace for barely 2 centuries. You have no experience with the true horror of galactic warfare. The Thakari cannot be trusted. Emma's response was quiet but firm. "You're right, Counselor. We haven't experienced galactic warfare. But we've experienced something else that might be more relevant to this situation." She gestured, and new data began flowing to the Assembly's information networks. Historical records, casualty reports, archived footage of conflicts that seemed impossibly brutal despite their planetary scope. For most of our recorded history, humans fought each other. We developed weapons that could destroy our entire world. We committed atrocities that we thought made us irredeemable. We created enemies out of neighbors, convinced that our differences made coexistence impossible. The images flowing through the data streams showed the worst of human nature wars fought over resources, ideology, territory, and simple misunderstanding. The assembled aliens watched with growing horror as humanity's capacity for violence became clear. But we learned something, Emma continued. We learned that the same capacity for violence that makes us dangerous also makes us capable of extraordinary acts of protection and sacrifice. The same tribalism that creates enemies can be redirected to defend those we choose to call family. Captain Vale's carapace clicked nervously. You're suggesting the Thakari could be rehabilitated? I'm suggesting they already have been. Emma replied. By desperation, by suffering, by 3,000 years of fighting a war they never wanted to fight. The question isn't whether they can change, it's whether we can give them the chance to prove they already have. Ambassador Rin pulsed with thoughtful bioluminescence. Dr. Cross, your proposal requires unprecedented trust. If you're wrong about the Thakari's intentions, then Earth will pay the price, Emma acknowledged. The 17 worlds we're offering for Thakari resettlement are all within our defensive sphere. If they betray this trust, we'll be the first to know and the first to suffer. The weight of that commitment settled over the assembly like a heavy blanket. Earth wasn't just proposing a solution, they were volunteering to serve as the galaxy's test case for redemption. Admiral Kess felt something shift in her understanding of the young human species. Their proposal wasn't born from naivety or ignorance of warfare's cost. It was born from hard-won wisdom about the price of perpetual conflict. There's something else, Emma added, her voice carrying a note of carefully controlled emotion. 3 days ago, we received a message from the Thakari High Command. They want to speak directly to this assembly. The chamber erupted in shocked conversation. For 3 millennia, Thakari communication had consisted entirely of ultimatums and threats. The concept of diplomatic dialogue seemed as foreign as their biology. They're prepared to make a formal surrender, Emma continued over the noise. Complete cessation of hostilities, full disclosure of their military capabilities, and submission to galactic authority during the transition process. High Counselor. Drax's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. And if we refuse? If this assembly decides the risk is too great? Emma's expression grew grave. Then they'll fight until the last Thakari dies. Not because they want to, but because dying as warriors is preferable to dying as beggars. Their homeworld has perhaps 50 years left before their sun's instability makes it uninhabitable. If we don't offer them hope, they'll spend those 50 years taking as much of the galaxy with them as possible. The mathematics of extinction suddenly became clear to every species in the chamber. A cornered enemy with nothing left to lose was infinitely more dangerous than one with hope for the future. Ancient observer patterns pulsed with deep recognition. The humans understand what we forgot. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most weapons, but the one with no choice. Emma nodded solemnly. We're offering the Thakari the most dangerous thing in the universe, a choice to be something other than what they've always been. The question is whether the galaxy is brave enough to make that same choice. The Thakari delegation arrived in a ship that looked more like a weapon than a diplomatic vessel, all sharp angles and ablative armor, scarred by millennia of warfare. But as it docked with the Harmony's voice, even the most skeptical observers had to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of the moment. For the first time in 3,000 years, Thakari representatives were boarding a neutral vessel without firing a shot. Admiral Kess watched through the docking bay's observation windows as the airlock cycled open. Her 4 hearts were beating in complex patterns of anticipation and fear. Beside her, Dr. Emma Cross stood with the calm composure that had become her trademark, though Kess noticed the human's hands were clasped tightly behind her back. The first Thakari to emerge defied every expectation the galaxy had built around their species. Commander. Veth was old, not just aged, but worn down by the weight of centuries spent fighting a war he'd never wanted to start. His chitinous exoskeleton, once the glossy black of a warrior in his prime, had dulled to the gray of weathered stone. Scars covered his form, but they weren't the proud battle wounds of a conqueror. They were the desperate marks of a survivor. Behind him came 6 other Thakari, each bearing the same weary dignity. They moved without the predatory grace that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia. Instead, they carried themselves with the careful deliberation of beings who had finally laid down an unbearable burden. Admiral Kess, Veth's voice came through. Translation matrices that had never before been used for Thakari diplomacy. Dr. Cross, I am Commander Veth of the Dying Light, last war leader of the Thakari Confederation. I come to surrender my people to your mercy. The words hung in the recycled air of the docking bay like something precious and fragile. High Counselor Drac stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing even the imposing Thakari delegation. You expect mercy, he growled. After 3,000 years of slaughter? Veth's compound eyes focused on the scarred warrior with unflinching directness. I expect nothing, Counselor. I hope for everything. There's a difference that my people have forgotten in our desperation to survive. Dr. Cross stepped between them, her small human form seeming insignificant beside these titans of galactic warfare, but her voice carried absolute authority. Commander Veth, you've come to make an offer to this assembly. They deserve to hear it. The Thakari leader nodded slowly, then did something that sent shockwaves through every observer. He knelt. The motion was awkward for his arthropod physiology, but unmistakably deliberate. Behind him, his delegation followed suit. 3,000 years ago, Veth began, his translated voice carrying harmonics of profound regret. My ancestors faced a choice between death and damnation. They chose damnation, believing it would save our species. Instead, it has made us into something we never wished to become. Ambassador Rin's aquatic form pulsed with cautious sympathy. You're saying the Thakari were not naturally aggressive? We were gardeners, Veth replied, the simple statement falling like a bomb into the assembly's preconceptions. Before our sun began dying, before the biological modifications, before the first desperate raids for habitable worlds, we were gardeners. We cultivated life, not destroyed it. The ancient observers whose memories span geological ages began accessing their deepest archives. Slowly, carefully, fragments of nearly forgotten history began to emerge. Records from the galaxy's youth, when the Thakari homeworld had been known for its extraordinary biodiversity and peaceful nature. The modifications that turned us into warriors, Veth continued. They were supposed to be temporary. Emergency protocols to help us survive long enough to find new homes. But the modifications changed more than our bodies. They changed our minds, our capacity for choice. Commander Vale's carapace clicked with scientific curiosity. Are you saying you weren't responsible for your actions? Veth's response carried the weight of absolute honesty. No, Captain. We were responsible. We chose to embrace what the modifications made us rather than fight against it. We chose to believe that conquest was easier than cooperation. We chose wrong, again and again, until choosing wrongly became the only choice we could see. He paused, his ancient form trembling with emotion that transcended species barriers. Dr. Cross showed us something we had forgotten existed. She showed us a choice we thought we had lost forever, the choice to be better than our worst impulses. Emma stepped forward, her hand extended toward the kneeling Thakari commander. Please stand, Commander. Today we're all equals here. As Veth rose, accepting the humans' offered support, the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The galaxy's youngest spacefaring species, helping the galaxy's oldest enemy to stand. The Thakari Confederation formally surrenders all military assets to the Galactic Coalition, Veth announced. We offer full reparations for damage caused, complete technological disclosure for terraforming restoration, And most importantly, we offer ourselves to whatever justice this assembly deems appropriate. Admiral Kess found herself thinking of her own species' long history, the wars they'd fought, the enemies they'd made, and sometimes, rarely, the enemies they'd made into friends. "Commander Veth," she said slowly, "what does your species want?" Now, the old warrior's answer was simple, profound, and heartbreakingly honest: to go home. Not to our dying world, but to who we used to be. Dr. Cross has offered us 17 worlds where we can rebuild not just our bodies, but our souls. In return, we offer something we've never given before: our word that the galaxy will never again have reason to fear the Thakari name. The assembly voted unanimously. 3 months later, the first Thakari settlement ships departed for their new homes, escorted not by warships, but by construction vessels carrying terraforming equipment. The species that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 millennia were about to begin the slow process of remembering how to nurture life instead of destroying it. And Earth, the world that hadn't been invited to the War Council, had given the galaxy something more valuable than victory. They had given it peace, and the revolutionary idea that even the worst enemies might simply be friends who had forgotten how to stop fighting. The war was over. The real work of building a better galaxy was just beginning.